Okay, this is the pre-lecture for Thursday, which is going to be about payments for ecosystem services, conservation and valuation, and economics. And the theme here is why conservation ecologists need to think about economics. And I'm going to talk a bit about these four things: efficiency frontiers, multiple benefits, monetizing, and payments for ecosystem services, although I've rearranged the order. So the arguments for ecosystem valuation is that this is mainstreaming natural resource stewardship, that people really need to think about their bottom line, and by putting resource stewardship into that bottom line, it benefits people and the capacity to do stuff. It also is of value because it highlights the true cost of ecosystem services, and there's been a lot made about how much relative to the world's gross domestic product, ecosystem services contribute. And it creates a structure with which to for partners to with disparate benefits to talk about the same kinds of disparate interests to talk about the same kinds of benefits and put things on the same playing field. But there's a lot of contrarian views as well. There have been few social ecological systems where the balance sheet pencils out in favor of conservation. Usually it pencils out in favor of resource exploitation. And government structures aren't well situated to manage these programs, and we'll talk a bit about that with China. And most examples that are in the academic literature are generalized caricatures that seem appealing but are not really very implementable at this stage. So this idea of multiple benefits accounting is simple, but it has many different visages. So we're going to talk next week about community-based conservation and this idea of really engaging people in the conservation of the resources that are good for them. And so one of the guises of that has been the International Conservation Development Program that brings economic development to rural people and to try and help reduce impacts on natural systems while improving livelihoods. And as we'll see, that's done quite well for improving livelihoods, but not that much for conservation. But there's also ecosystem drivers for these kinds of programs. That Ramsar was an early international agreement on the protection of wetlands because it protects both wildlife habitat and sediment and nutrient retention, but it also protects against floods. And we've heard a lot about recently about forest protection through REDD+, the reduction of emissions through deforestation and degradation, the plus meaning other ecosystem benefits. And we have a couple of great cases in California. One is California rice agriculture, which has changed dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years and brought more value to the rice agriculture industry while also bringing value to wildlife. And so it is possible to have successful stories in this area. And so a common way people think about this is this idea of this triple bottom line, is that you want to increase capital, economic growth, but you also want to increase social capital and have and environmental capital or natural capital. And so this is a touchstone for people thinking about these kinds of problems. The story with rice, I'm not going to go into great details, but in the 1990s we would burn rice fields, and the argument was that you had to burn rice fields because otherwise they'd build up disease, and it created huge air quality problems in the Central Valley of California. It was made illegal. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy started working with farm growers, particularly in the Casumnas, to show that an alteration of flooding can be a good proxy for reducing disease in rice and provided wildlife benefits to those people. So that in fact you could increase water use, increase profit to farmers by creating a rice growing practice that remained profitable and allowing farmers to sell hunting concessions because of all the wildlife that would then be visiting their lands. And so there are some rice growers now where most of their income is actually from hunting and not from the rice itself. Of course, there are problems with this, maybe a decrease in water use efficiency as well, but nonetheless, it's an example of a sort of one of those win-win-win situations for conservation and the environment, both in air quality and bird populations and rice growers. So naturally, if this is a question, then academics have gotten involved, and there are a lot of resource economists who are in the business of estimating market value of public goods to try and monetize natural resources or non-market values so as to motivate government action. And these have taken many different forms. There's this non-market valuation, willingness to pay, willingness to accept, travel cost method, hedonic pricing, choice modeling, stated preferences. I'll show a little diagram of how they relate to each other in the next slide. But they're basically things like asking people how much would you pay to protect pandas, or how much could someone pay you to forego the existence of pandas, and how much do travel costs is how much do people actually pay to go see pandas, and hedonic pricing is how much more does it cost to go to China to see pandas versus going to someplace else or China and not seeing pandas, or going someplace else to see pandas. But anyway, so it's basically a differential of that value. So for example, hedonic pricing of what's the value of a lake, you could ask what the price of a house and then another house of comparable value that is on a lake. So you're and then estimating the value of that lake in terms of real estate. And so these are stated preferences or choice models, and given choices, how do you allocate your resources? So Spangenberg and Sattel have this sort of this tree of some of these methods of how to estimate values of market or non-market goods. So over in market goods, you just have a market price on real goods that have a direct estimate of the value. For things that aren't actually being sold, you can think about an option value, but again, that translates readily to money. But these non-market goods, you either have revealed preferences by your actions through things like travel costs and hedonic pricing, where you're actually doing something and this is revealing how much you're willing to spend, or you have these stated preferences basically and how much you're going to try, how much you say you'd be willing to pay. And let's see this. So there's also over on this market goods, these repair costs and avoidance costs, things that are hypothetical based on how much people are willing to pay for insurance for things like that, etc. So, okay, so there's lots of different ways of doing this evaluation. But there's lots of challenges to evaluation. So it assumes that free market capitalism is the appropriate context. And this instrumentalizes the intrinsic values of nature. And I was in a meeting of the EPA where they're talking about this, and there's kind of a knockdown drag out on the stage between two people who had very divergent views. One of whom was saying, that he refuses to place a market value on his 30-year marriage to his wife, that it has an infinite value to him. It means, and how can you economize that? And the economist saying, well, you might not be able to, but we can. I mean, we do that through insurance. And this, I think, highlights the very tension here, in that, sure, we are perfectly willing through insurance to place a value on human life, but it's a funny kind of value, isn't it? I mean, that if I'm going to buy an insurance policy on myself, I'm actually purchasing some amount of value that I think my family might need in the absence of my income. And that's not really how I perceive the value of my life. And so it's valuing something, but it's not clear that it's valuing the life. And so there's this tension about whether you actually can economize these things in this way. And so there's that philosophical differences in opinion about the value of these kinds of efforts. But there's also really functional ones, in that methods are just fraught with problems. So willingness to pay and actually paying are different things. And you can imagine now I ask you, how much are you willing to pay to see the preservation of pandas? And you give me an answer. So let's say it's $100. Now I say, how much are you willing to pay to see that pandas, elephants, rhinoceros, freshwater porpoises, and a list of 100 different things are saved, and your answer is likely to be more than $100, but it's probably not going to scale linearly with those species, and therefore how you ask the questions and what you're asking about really makes a strong difference in the kind of answer you get. And so there's limits to the kinds of questions that travel costs or hedonic pricing can actually address. And that there's often collateral benefits, and so more than just the existence value. There's a tourism value, and so sometimes there are market and non-market values that are combined. So it's a very complex thing and not without problems, and so they're usually estimated with a considerable amount of error, and probably often better thought of as relative values than absolute values. Okay, so there's also this issue of thinking about efficiency frontiers and thinking about the economics of conservation in a slightly different way. I think we're going to go into this in more detail on Thursday, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but just basically to say that I think I've shown this graph before in classes that we tend to think of if environmental benefits on the y-axis and dollar benefits on the x-axis, we generally think of conservation as having this linear trade-off that would go from point A, H to I to A. And Pulaski and others using economics suggest that we might often find these efficiency frontiers where we can, by trying to jointly maximize benefit, we can move that line and it's really curvilinear, so we can get out somewhere around E, where we're achieving most of the economic benefit that we have in the system with by minimizing the economic loss. And that's functionally what this spatial prioritization thing is. We went through this case earlier with zonation and Moylan and his group, and the other one being Marksand, is that through spatial prioritization you may be able to move up that efficiency horizon and get more conservation benefit at a lower cost. I guess the unspoken corollary there is that by reducing costs, you're also increasing the capacity for economic gain. And so there are, of course, some rather less formal ways of thinking about this, and sort of a real practical-minded approach to this. Science for Nature and People Partnerships is one of those things, looking for practical ways to increase efficiency. And another pragmatist approach to this is that the TNC has developed a thing called conservation business planning, where they say in order to launch conservation, you really need a business plan, and it's a very practical-minded approach to conservation. How are you going to pay for whatever actions you're saying you're going to do? And I should just mention, as an aside, that when TNC rolled out its conservation business planning, it threw all of the open standards people for a bit of a loop because they felt it was subverting it. But and really, it's more complementary than subversion, but it's still a challenge to them. And then there's the more academic approach. Hey, economists can do conservation too. Conservationists can even be economists. So there's a natural capital project that I think we'll talk a bit about. And this whole idea of how academicians have been thinking about payments for ecosystem services, where you create a voluntary transaction with a well-defined environmental service, and that's being bought by some service buyer from a service provider, and that then there's some constraints in there. And so there's been a variety of efforts to suggest how this might work for conservation. And then there's a lot of different kinds of programs for this. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I'm going to talk about a couple of them, and as a consequence, I'm going to go a little bit over 15 minutes. But this is also going to end with framing the discussion section on Thursday. So please, I'll just stop here and start the next one.